My name is Maya Rodriguez, and the last time my cousins laughed at my clearance rack dress and scuffed shoes, they had no idea they were standing in the shadow of a woman who would inherit more money than their parents spent on their Scottsdale mansions. It was at Abuela Elena's funeral reception, all polished marble and hushed conversations, when Mr. Peterson adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and spoke the words that turned their world upside down. Maya Rodriguez inherits the entirety of the Rodriguez construction and development empire, including all subsidiaries, properties, and liquid assets, valued at $3.2 billion. The cousins who had just been whispering about my charity case lifestyle suddenly looked like they'd seen a ghost. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The Phoenix heat was already brutal at 9 in the morning as I pulled my faded Toyota Corolla into the parking lot of the Scottsdale Country Club. The valet's eyes lingered on my car with barely concealed disgust, as if my vehicle might contaminate the row of gleaming BMWs and Mercedes that stretched across the pristine asphalt. I handed him the keys without meeting his gaze, smoothing down my black dress that I'd bought 3 years ago at a Goodwill on Central Avenue. It was respectable enough for a funeral, even if it couldn't compete with the designer mourning wear that my cousins would inevitably be sporting. The Rodriguez family had always been a study in contrasts, but never more so than today, as we gathered to say goodbye to the woman who had built an empire from desert dust and determination. Abuela Elena had passed peacefully in her sleep at 87, leaving behind a legacy that most of the family was only beginning to understand. To Brandon, Ashley, and Tyler, she was the eccentric grandmother who inexplicably chose to live in a modest duplex in Maryvale instead of the sprawling estates they assumed she could afford. To me, she was the woman who had raised me after my father died, who taught me that wealth meant nothing if you forgot where you came from, and who spoke to me in rapid Spanish while cooking beans and rice on her ancient stovetop. Walking through the country club's towering glass doors, I was immediately transported into a world that felt as foreign to me as Mars. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow patterns across cream-colored walls, and the scent of expensive flowers filled the air with an almost overwhelming perfume. Women in black Chanel suits air-kissed each other while men in $1,000 suits discussed golf handicaps and stock portfolios. This was the world my cousins inhabited naturally, moving through it with the confidence of people who had never questioned their right to be there. I spotted Brandon first, standing near the memorial display with his perfectly styled hair and his black Armani suit that probably cost more than I made in 2 months teaching 3rd grade at Desert Bloom Elementary. His sister Ashley was beside him, her blonde highlights catching the light as she gestured dramatically while speaking to a group of their college friends. Tyler, their cousin from the other side of the family, was working the room like a politician, his smile bright and his handshake firm as he networked even at a funeral. They were all there, the golden children of the Rodriguez family, the ones who had gone to private schools and taken European vacations, while I was learning to stretch a grocery budget and mend my own clothes. The irony wasn't lost on me that we were mourning Abuela Elena in a place she would have found absurd. She had been a woman who valued substance over flash, who could spot pretension from a mile away, and had no patience for people who measured worth by the labels in their closets. But Uncle Robert, Brandon and Ashley's father, had insisted on hosting the reception here, claiming it was appropriate for someone of Elena's stature in the community. What he really meant was that it was appropriate for his stature, for the image he wanted to project of a family that belonged in country clubs and charity galas. I made my way to the memory table, where photographs of Abuela Elena's long life were arranged among white roses and baby's breath. There she was at 25, standing next to my grandfather outside their first construction trailer, both of them covered in dust and grinning at the camera. Another photo showed her at 50, wearing a hard hat as she surveyed one of the Rodriguez construction job sites, her dark eyes sharp with intelligence and determination. But my favorite was a recent one, taken just last Christmas, showing her in her tiny kitchen teaching me how to make her famous tamales, both of us laughing at some joke she'd made in Spanish that no one else in the family would have understood. Maya, Ashley's voice cut through my reverie like nails on a chalkboard. She approached with her arms outstretched, enveloping me in a hug that smelled like expensive perfume and felt about as genuine as a $3 bill. "Oh honey, you look so sad. Are you holding up okay?" Her concern was theatrical, designed more for the audience of her friends than for any genuine care about my well-being. She pulled back to examine my appearance, her eyes taking in my discount dress and drugstore makeup with the kind of subtle disdain that wealthy people have perfected into an art form. "I'm managing," I replied, keeping my voice steady and neutral. I had learned long ago not to rise to Ashley's bait, not to engage with the passive-aggressive games that seemed to be her specialty. She had been perfecting this routine since we were children, the concerned older cousin act that barely concealed her belief that I was somehow deficient, somehow less than the rest of them, because I didn't share their obsession with material possessions and social status. Brandon joined us, sliding his arm around his sister's waist in a gesture that managed to be both protective and exclusionary. "It's good that you came, Maya. I know Abuela would have wanted you here, even though this isn't really your usual scene." His tone was carefully modulated, sympathetic on the surface, but with an undercurrent that suggested I was out of place among all this elegance. He glanced around the room, taking in the marble columns and the waitstaff circulating with champagne flutes, before looking back at me with what he probably thought was kindness. "These fancy places can be intimidating when you're not used to them." The assumption in his voice made my stomach clench, but I simply nodded and moved away from them toward the bar. I ordered a club soda with lime, declining the alcohol because I wanted to keep my head clear for whatever the day might bring. The bartender, a young man with kind eyes, handed me my drink with a sympathetic smile that seemed more genuine than anything I'd received from my own family. I found a quiet corner near a floor-to-ceiling window that overlooked the golf course, watching the perfectly manicured greens stretch toward the desert mountains in the distance. From my vantage point, I could observe the family dynamics playing out across the room like a carefully choreographed dance. Uncle Robert was holding court near the memorial display, accepting condolences with the gravity of a head of state, his wife Patricia beside him in a black St. John suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Their children, Brandon and Ashley, were working different sections of the room, Brandon focusing on the business associates, while Ashley charmed the social connections. Tyler was bouncing between groups, his natural charisma making him popular with everyone from the elderly family friends to the young professionals who had come to pay their respects.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
And then there was me, standing alone by the window in my Goodwill dress, watching it all unfold like an anthropologist studying a foreign culture. This had been my role in the Rodriguez family for as long as I could remember, the observer, the outsider, the one who was included out of obligation rather than genuine affection. Not because I was unwelcome, exactly, but because I had never quite learned to speak their language of designer labels and exclusive experiences. I was the scholarship kid in a family of trust fund babies, the public school teacher among the business executives and socialites. The truth was, I had stopped trying to fit into their world years ago. After my father died when I was 12, leaving my mother and me with nothing but his old pickup truck and a mountain of medical debt, we had moved in with Abuela Elena in her modest duplex. While my cousins were taking horseback riding lessons and attending cotillion, I was learning to clip coupons and shop the clearance racks. While they were being driven to school in luxury SUVs, I was riding the city bus and walking the last 6 blocks to save money. It wasn't a tragic childhood by any means, but it was a different one, shaped by necessity rather than privilege. Abuela Elena had been my anchor during those difficult years, the one person who seemed to understand that there were different ways to measure success and happiness. She taught me to cook traditional Mexican dishes on a budget, to find beauty in simple things like sunrise over the desert or the smell of rain on hot asphalt. She showed me how to tend a garden in the tiny backyard of the duplex, growing tomatoes and peppers and herbs that made our simple meals taste like feasts. Most importantly, she taught me that dignity didn't come from what you owned, but from how you treated other people, especially those who had less than you did. Maya Rodriguez. A voice behind me interrupted my thoughts, and I turned to see a distinguished man in his 60s approaching with a leather briefcase. His silver hair was perfectly groomed, and his charcoal suit was expensive but understated, the kind that spoke of old money rather than new flash. "I'm James Peterson, your grandmother's attorney. I was hoping we could speak privately before we begin the formal proceedings." I nodded, feeling a flutter of nervousness in my chest. I had no idea what Abuela Elena might have left me in her will, but I suspected it wouldn't be much. She had lived so modestly, so simply, that I had always assumed she had just enough money to get by on Social Security, and perhaps a small pension from the early days of Rodriguez construction. The duplex would probably go to Uncle Robert, along with whatever savings she had managed to accumulate over the years. I hoped she might have left me some of her jewelry, or perhaps her recipe collection, something sentimental that would help me remember her voice and her gentle hands. Mr. Peterson led me to a small conference room off the main reception area, closing the door behind us to create a pocket of silence in the midst of the gathering crowd. He gestured for me to sit across from him at a polished wooden table, then opened his briefcase with practiced efficiency. Inside were several thick folders, and what appeared to be a bound document of considerable length. He pulled out his reading glasses and looked at me with an expression that seemed both serious and oddly sympathetic. "Maya, I need you to understand that what I'm about to tell you may come as quite a shock," he began, his voice gentle but firm. "Your grandmother was a very private woman, and she had specific reasons for keeping certain information within a very small circle of advisors. She made me promise that I would explain everything to you personally, away from the rest of the family, before we proceeded with the formal reading of the will." My hands were suddenly cold despite the warmth of the room, and I wrapped them around my club soda glass to steady myself. "I don't understand. What kind of information?" Mr. Peterson opened the first folder and spread several documents across the table between us. They looked official and intimidating, filled with legal language and corporate letterheads that meant nothing to me. "Maya, your grandmother Elena Rodriguez was not just the founder of Rodriguez Construction. Over the past 60 years, she built what is now one of the largest private development companies in the Southwest United States. Rodriguez Construction and Development owns commercial properties in 12 states, residential developments in 8 major metropolitan areas, and a portfolio of investments that spans everything from technology startups to renewable energy projects." I stared at the papers in front of me, trying to process what he was saying. The words seemed to be coming from very far away, as if I were listening to them through water. But she lived in a duplex in Maryvale. She drove a 15-year-old Honda. She clipped coupons and shopped at the dollar store. "Yes," Mr. Peterson said with a small smile. "She did all of those things deliberately. Your grandmother believed very strongly that wealth without wisdom was dangerous, that money without character was meaningless. She wanted to know which of her grandchildren would love and respect her for who she was, not what she could give them. She wanted to see who would visit her in that duplex, who would sit in her kitchen and listen to her stories, who would appreciate the simple meals she cooked, and the simple life she chose to live." The implications of his words were beginning to sink in, creating a strange buzzing sensation in my head. "You're saying she was testing us?" "In a way, yes, but it wasn't a cruel test, Maya. It was the test of a woman who had seen too many families destroyed by money, too many children who learned to value inheritance over integrity. She watched all of her grandchildren carefully over the years. She saw who came to visit regularly, and who only appeared at Christmas. She noticed who spoke Spanish with her, and who was too busy to learn. She observed who helped her with groceries and who assumed she could handle everything herself despite her age. I thought about all those afternoons I had spent in Abuela Elena's kitchen, all the Saturday mornings when I would drive over to help her with shopping or to work in her garden. I remembered how Brandon and Ashley would sometimes complain about having to visit her, how they would spend their time texting or checking social media while she tried to tell them stories about the old days. I thought about Tyler, who was always polite but distant, treating her like a pleasant obligation rather than a beloved family member. There's something else, Mr. Peterson continued, opening another folder. Your grandmother owned the entire block where her duplex sits. That modest little neighborhood in Maryvale. It's sitting on some of the most valuable commercial real estate in Phoenix. The city has been trying to buy it for years to extend the light rail system. She could have sold it for $50 million 10 years ago, but she chose to stay because that was where she belonged, where she felt most like herself. The room seemed to be spinning slightly, and I gripped the edge of the table to steady myself. I don't understand why she never told me any of this. All these years, I thought she was struggling financially. I used to bring her groceries, slip $20 bills into her purse when she wasn't looking. I felt sorry for her, because I thought she couldn't afford the things that Uncle Robert's family took for granted. And that, Maya, is exactly why she chose you. Mr. Peterson's voice was warm with something that might have been admiration. You loved her enough to share what little you had. You cared about her comfort and her dignity even when you thought she had nothing to give you in return. Your cousins love her too, in their way, but their love was always conditional on maintaining their image of themselves as the successful ones, the ones who had surpassed their humble beginnings. They visited her out of duty. You visited her out of love. I walked out of that conference room feeling like I was floating 3 feet above the ground, my mind struggling to reconcile everything Mr. Peterson had just told me with the reality I had known for 28 years. The woman I had thought was scraping by on Social Security was actually worth more money than I could even conceptualize. The duplex where I had learned to make tortillas from scratch was sitting on a goldmine of commercial real estate. The grandmother who had taught me to darn socks and repair broken appliances had been quietly running a business empire that spanned multiple states. The reception was in full swing when I returned to the main hall, the conversations having shifted from solemn remembrances to the kind of animated discussions that money and power tend to generate. I could see Uncle Robert near the bar, his voice carrying across the room as he regaled a group of businessmen with stories about the early days of Rodriguez construction. From the way he spoke, you would have thought he had built the company himself rather than inheriting his position as operations manager from his mother. His gestures were grand and confident, his laugh booming with the authority of someone who had never questioned his place in the world. Patricia, his wife, was holding court on the opposite side of the room, her perfectly manicured hands gesturing elegantly as she discussed the funeral arrangements with a group of society women. She had transformed Abuela Elena's simple wishes for a modest service into an elaborate production worthy of a corporate event, complete with professional florists, a catered reception, and enough flowers to stock a garden center. It was beautiful in its way, but it felt more like a celebration of the Rodriguez family's social status than a remembrance of the woman who had preferred beans and rice to 5-star restaurants. Brandon and Ashley were working the room like the seasoned professionals they had become, moving seamlessly between groups of mourners with the kind of social grace that came from years of country club dinners and charity galas. Brandon had positioned himself near the memorial display, where he could intercept business associates and potential clients who came to pay their respects. His conversations were masterful blends of grief and networking, expressing appropriate sorrow while subtly reinforcing his position as the next generation of Rodriguez leadership. Ashley had claimed the area near the dessert table, where she could catch people in a more relaxed mood and work her particular brand of charm. She had changed into her second black dress of the day, this one a designer piece that probably cost more than my monthly salary, and she wore it with the casual confidence of someone who had never had to check a price tag. Her laugh rang out at regular intervals, bright and musical and perfectly calibrated to draw attention without seeming inappropriate for a funeral. Tyler was perhaps the most impressive of them all, moving through the crowd like a politician campaigning for office. He had an uncanny ability to remember names and personal details, asking after people's children and business ventures with the kind of focused attention that made everyone feel like they were the most important person in the room. He had graduated from Arizona State University with a degree in business administration and had immediately landed a position at a prestigious consulting firm in Scottsdale, where he specialized in helping family businesses navigate succession planning. Watching them all perform their roles with such practiced ease, I felt like an anthropologist observing some exotic social ritual. This was their natural habitat, this world of expensive suits and strategic conversations, of networking disguised as mourning and grief transformed into opportunity. They moved through it with the unconscious confidence of people who had been raised to believe that they belonged in rooms like this, that success and status were their birthright rather than their achievements. I, on the other hand, felt like I was wearing a costume that didn't quite fit. My black dress, which had seemed perfectly appropriate when I put it on that morning, now felt shabby and out of place among the designer morning wear that surrounded me. My shoes, which I had polished carefully the night before, looked scuffed and worn compared to the Italian leather and designer heels that clicked across the marble floors. Even my purse, a practical black bag that I had bought at Target 3 years ago, seemed to announce my outsider status to anyone who cared to look. But the strangest part was that none of it mattered anymore. The knowledge that Mr. Peterson had shared with me had created a strange bubble of detachment around everything I was observing. The elaborate reception, the expensive clothes, the careful positioning and strategic conversations, it all felt like elaborate theater performed for an audience that didn't realize the script had already been rewritten. In a few hours, when the will was read aloud, the entire dynamic of the Rodriguez family would shift in ways that none of them could imagine. I made my way to the ladies' room, needing a few minutes of silence to process everything that was happening. The bathroom was as elegant as the rest of the country club, with marble countertops and gold fixtures that gleamed under the soft lighting. I stood in front of the mirror looking at my reflection and trying to reconcile the woman staring back at me with the woman who would soon inherit billions of dollars. My face looked the same, my olive skin that showed my Mexican heritage, dark eyes that had inherited my father's intensity, black hair that I had pulled back into a simple bun that morning. Nothing had changed physically, but everything had changed fundamentally. The door opened behind me, and Ashley walked in with 2 of her college friends, their voices bright with the kind of animated conversation that expensive wine tends to produce. They were discussing the reception, comparing it favorably to other high society events they had attended, when Ashley noticed me standing at the sink. "Oh, Maya," she exclaimed, her voice carrying that particular tone of surprise that suggested she had forgotten I existed. "Are you doing okay, sweetie? This must all be so overwhelming for you." She turned to her friends with a knowing look. "Maya isn't really used to these kinds of events. She's more of a stay-at-home type, aren't you, honey?" One of her friends, a blonde woman with the kind of perfect teeth that came from expensive orthodontics, smiled at me with sympathetic condescension. "It's so nice that the family includes everyone, regardless of their circumstances. That's what real family is about, right? Supporting each other even when some people haven't been as fortunate as others." The second friend, a brunette wearing what looked like a Chanel suit, nodded earnestly. "Absolutely. It's important to remember that not everyone has the same opportunities in life. Some people are just more naturally suited to simple lifestyles, and there's nothing wrong with that." Ashley beamed at her friends as if they had just delivered profound wisdom. "Exactly. Maya has always been perfectly happy with her little teaching job and her little apartment. She's never been ambitious in the traditional sense, but she's very sweet, very genuine. There's something to be said for people who are content with less, you know." I stood there listening to them discuss me as if I were a mildly interesting specimen in a museum display, feeling a strange mixture of amusement and irritation. They were so completely confident in their assessment of my life and my character, so certain that they understood my place in the world and my limitations as a person. The irony was almost overwhelming. Here they were, expressing pity for my simple lifestyle, completely unaware that in a few hours I would be revealed as the wealthiest person in the room. "It must be nice," the blonde friend continued, "to have such an uncomplicated life. No pressure to achieve or compete, or constantly improve yourself, just simple contentment. Very zen, really." "Oh, Maya's always been like that," Ashley agreed. "Even when we were kids, she never seemed to want the things the rest of us wanted. While we were taking dance lessons and competing in pageants, she was happy just reading books and helping Abuela in her little garden. Different priorities, you know. I could have corrected them. I could have mentioned my master's degree in education, my fluency in 3 languages, my volunteer work with literacy programs, or any number of other accomplishments that might have complicated their simple narrative about my life. But something held me back, perhaps the knowledge that in a few hours, all of their assumptions would be shattered anyway, or perhaps just the understanding that people who were determined to see you as small would find ways to diminish any achievement you claimed. Instead, I simply smiled and nodded. Everyone finds their own path, I said quietly, washing my hands and reaching for a paper towel. Some paths are just more visible than others. Ashley's friends exchanged a look that clearly said they found my response quaint and philosophical in the way that simple people often were. They continued their conversation about the reception and their plans for the rest of the weekend as I dried my hands and prepared to leave. Just as I reached the door, Ashley called out to me, "Maya, you should sit with us during the will reading. I'm sure it's going to be mostly business stuff that won't really affect you, but it's important for family to stick together during these formal proceedings. Uncle Robert thinks there might be some small bequests for the grandchildren, maybe a few $1,000s each or some of Abuela's jewelry. Nothing life-changing, but every little bit helps, right?" The casual dismissiveness in her voice was almost breathtaking. She had already decided what I might receive from Abuela Elena's estate, and had determined that it would be appropriately modest for someone of my limited circumstances. The possibility that I might inherit anything significant hadn't even occurred to her, because in her mind, significant inheritances went to significant people, and I had been categorized as decidedly insignificant. "I'll find a seat somewhere," I replied, not trusting myself to say more. The temptation to hint at what was coming was almost overwhelming, but I managed to resist it. There would be time enough for revelations later, and I suspected that the impact would be far greater if it came without warning. I left the bathroom and wandered back toward the main reception area, where the crowd had grown larger and the conversations had grown louder. More business associates had arrived, along with family friends and members of Phoenix society who had known Abuela Elena through various charitable organizations. The guest list was an impressive cross-section of Arizona's social and economic elite, all gathered to pay their respects to a woman most of them had probably considered a quaint relic of an earlier, simpler time. Near the memorial display, I noticed a group of men in expensive suits discussing the future of Rodriguez construction with Uncle Robert. Their conversation was animated and confident, filled with references to upcoming projects and expansion opportunities. Uncle Robert was clearly positioning himself as the natural heir to his mother's business empire, describing his vision for the company's future with the authority of someone who had already been making the important decisions for years. Elena was a remarkable for her generation, he was saying, his voice carrying easily across the room. She had incredible instincts for the construction business, really pioneering spirit, but the industry has become much more complex since she started the company back in the 60s. Modern development requires sophisticated financial instruments, complex regulatory navigation, international partnerships. It's not something you can run from a kitchen table anymore. The men around him nodded knowingly, their expressions conveying complete agreement with his assessment. They were all cut from the same cloth, successful businessmen who had built their careers on leveraging capital and managing complex organizations. To them, the idea that Abuela Elena might have been running a sophisticated business empire from her modest duplex was simply inconceivable. They saw her as a sweet old lady who had gotten lucky in real estate and had wisely delegated the important decisions to her more qualified son. The transition should be seamless, Uncle Robert continued. "I've been handling the day-to-day operations for the past 10 years, and I have a complete understanding of all our assets and commitments. The legal team has everything prepared for a smooth transfer of authority. We expect to announce the new leadership structure within the next few weeks, once we've had time to properly grieve and handle the estate proceedings." I stood there listening to him plan his takeover of a company that he didn't even realize he wasn't going to inherit, feeling a surreal sense of disconnect from the entire scene. The confidence in his voice was absolute. His assumption of Succession complete and unquestioned. He had spent years positioning himself as the heir apparent to Rodriguez Construction, building relationships with clients and partners, establishing himself as the face of the company's future. The possibility that his mother might have had different plans for her empire had clearly never occurred to him. Brandon had joined the group, his presence adding another layer of assumed succession to the conversation. As Uncle Robert's son and the presumed heir to his position, Brandon represented the next generation of Rodriguez leadership, the young executive who would carry the family business into the future. His questions were intelligent and informed, demonstrating a sophisticated understanding of the construction industry and the challenges facing family businesses in an increasingly competitive marketplace. "I've been working on a comprehensive analysis of our development portfolio," Brandon was saying, pulling out his phone to show charts and graphs to the assembled businessmen. "I think there are significant opportunities for expansion into the renewable energy sector, particularly solar installations for commercial properties. The tax incentives alone make it an incredibly attractive market, and our existing relationships with municipal governments give us a huge competitive advantage." The men examined his presentation with the kind of serious attention that successful ideas deserved, nodding and asking detailed questions about implementation timelines and capital requirements. Brandon fielded their inquiries with confidence and precision, clearly demonstrating that he had inherited his father's business acumen along with his social skills. He was impressive in his own right, the kind of young executive that major corporations competed to recruit and retain. Watching him work the room, I found myself wondering what it would have been like to grow up with his advantages, his certainty about his place in the world, and his future prospects. He had never had to question whether he belonged in rooms like this, never had to worry about whether his clothes were appropriate or his education sufficient. From childhood, he had been groomed for leadership, given every opportunity to develop his talents and expand his horizons. His success wasn't accidental or undeserved. He had worked hard and made smart choices. But it had been built on a foundation of privilege that most people could only dream about. The irony was that his privilege was about to become irrelevant. All of his careful positioning, all of his strategic relationship building, all of his assumptions about his future role in the family business, none of it mattered anymore. In a few hours, he would discover that the empire he had expected to inherit was going to someone else entirely, someone he had spent years dismissing as irrelevant to the family's business interests. I found myself moving toward the bar, suddenly needing something stronger than club soda to help me process the magnitude of what was about to happen. The bartender, the same young man who had served me earlier, smiled sympathetically as I approached. "How are you holding up?" he asked quietly, his voice carrying genuine concern rather than the performative sympathy I had been receiving from my relatives. These big family events can be really tough, especially when you're dealing with grief at the same time. "It's been a day of surprises," I replied, accepting the glass of wine he poured for me. "I'm not sure I've processed everything yet." He nodded understandingly. "I've worked a lot of these memorial receptions over the years. Families are complicated, especially when there's money involved. People don't always handle grief and inheritance in the most graceful ways." His observation was more perceptive than he probably realized. I could already see the subtle maneuvering that was beginning to take place as family members and business associates positioned themselves for whatever opportunities might arise from Abuela Elena's death. The conversations had shifted from remembrance to speculation, from mourning to strategizing. It was a natural human response, perhaps, but it felt deeply disrespectful to the woman who had brought us all together. "She was a special lady," the bartender continued, polishing glasses as he spoke. "Used to come in here sometimes for the early bird dinners with some of her friends from church. Always tipped well, always remembered my name. Not like some of the regulars who treat the staff like furniture." I smiled, recognizing the Abuela Elena he was describing. She had possessed an innate dignity and kindness that had nothing to do with wealth or status, treating everyone from CEOs to busboys with the same respect and courtesy. It was a quality that seemed increasingly rare in a world where people were often valued primarily for what they could provide rather than who they were as human beings. She would have appreciated your kindness, I told him. She believed that how you treat people when you don't have to says everything about your character. The bartender's eyes lit up with recognition. That sounds exactly like something she would say. She had a way of making you think about things differently, you know. Like maybe success wasn't just about accumulating stuff, but about how much good you could do with whatever you had. His words hit me with unexpected force, reminding me of the enormous responsibility that was about to fall on my shoulders. Inheriting Abuela Elena's wealth wasn't just about receiving money, it was about carrying forward her values and her vision for how that wealth should be used. She had spent 60 years building an empire not for its own sake, but as a tool for creating opportunities and supporting communities. The question now was whether I would prove worthy of that trust, whether I could honor her legacy while forging my own path forward. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. I had spent my entire adult life living modestly, making careful financial decisions based on a teacher's salary and the need to save for an uncertain future. The idea of suddenly having access to billions of dollars was almost incomprehensible, like trying to imagine what it would be like to breathe underwater or fly through the air. How do you make decisions about resources that vast? How do you ensure that such enormous power is used responsibly and ethically? More importantly, how do you handle the relationships and family dynamics that such a dramatic change would inevitably create? In a few hours, I would go from being the poor cousin who needed help with groceries to being the wealthiest member of a family that had always measured worth primarily in financial terms. The people who had spent years treating me with benevolent condescension would suddenly need to recalibrate their entire understanding of who I was and where I fit in the family hierarchy. I finished my wine and checked my watch, noting that the formal will reading was scheduled to begin in 30 minutes. Mr. Peterson had arranged for the proceedings to take place in the country club's private conference room, where the family could gather away from the larger crowd of mourners and business associates. Only immediate family members and a few key business partners would be present for the reading, which meant that the audience for the revelation would be small but significant. The next half hour passed in a blur of final conversations and preparations. Uncle Robert made a brief speech thanking everyone for coming and celebrating Abuela Elena's remarkable life and legacy. Brandon and Ashley worked the room one last time, making sure they had connected with all the important guests and collected business cards from potential future contacts. Tyler positioned himself near the conference room door, ready to usher family members into the private space when the time came. As the crowd began to thin and the formal reception wound down, I found myself standing once again by the memorial display, looking at the photographs that told the story of Abuela Elena's extraordinary life. There she was as a young immigrant woman with nothing but determination and dreams, building a business from the ground up in a male-dominated industry. There she was as a mother and grandmother, balancing family responsibilities with the demands of running a growing company. And there she was in recent years, the successful businesswoman who had chosen to live simply, who had prioritized relationships over recognition and character over status. In just a few minutes, I would discover whether I had inherited not just her wealth but her wisdom, whether I could carry forward her values while navigating the complex challenges that such enormous resources would inevitably bring, whether I could honor her memory while becoming the person she had believed I could be. The time for wondering was almost over. Mr. Peterson appeared at my elbow, his expression serious but kind, ready to escort the family into the conference room where the final chapter of Abuela Elena's story would be revealed and the first chapter of mine would begin. The conference room at the Scottsdale Country Club was designed to impress, with rich mahogany paneling and leather chairs arranged around a massive oval table that could have seated 20 people comfortably. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the golf course, where the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the perfectly manicured fairways. Despite the elegant surroundings, there was a tension in the air that even the most sophisticated decor couldn't disguise. This was where family fortunes were decided, where carefully laid plans either came to fruition or crumbled into dust. Uncle Robert took his position at the head of the table with the confidence of a man who had never doubted his rightful place in the world. His expensive suit was perfectly tailored, his silver hair styled with precision, and his posture conveyed the authority of someone accustomed to making important decisions and having them respected without question. To his right sat Patricia, her diamond jewelry catching the light as she arranged her purse and notepad with the efficiency of a woman who had attended countless board meetings and charity committee gatherings. They presented themselves as the natural heirs to Abuela Elena's legacy, the couple who had been preparing for this moment for decades. Brandon and Ashley flanked their parents, their body language mirroring the confidence that had been bred into them since childhood. Brandon had removed his suit jacket and rolled up his sleeves slightly, the gesture suggesting that he was ready to get down to business and handle whatever administrative details the inheritance might require. Ashley sat with perfect posture, her hands folded elegantly in her lap, occasionally checking her phone to respond to messages from friends who were undoubtedly curious about the family proceedings. Both of them carried themselves with the casual certainty of people who had never had reason to doubt their good fortune. Tyler occupied the chair across from them, his laptop open and ready to take notes on whatever decisions might need to be made. As the family member with the most formal business education, he had positioned himself as the unofficial advisor for inheritance matters, ready to offer his expertise on tax implications and estate planning strategies. His expression was focused and professional, the look of someone who took his responsibilities seriously and prided himself on his analytical abilities. At the far end of the table, I sat quietly in my clearance rack dress, feeling like an actress who had wandered onto the wrong stage. The leather chair was more comfortable than anything in my small apartment, and the view from the windows was breathtaking, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was occupying space that belonged to someone more important. My hands rested on the polished table surface, and I found myself staring at my unmanicured nails and thinking about how different they looked from the perfectly groomed hands of the other women in the room. Mr. Peterson entered carrying his leather briefcase and a stack of documents that seemed thick enough to contain the secrets of the universe. He moved with the measured pace of someone who had conducted hundreds of similar meetings, but there was something in his expression that suggested this particular reading would be unlike any he had supervised before. He nodded respectfully to each family member as he took his seat at the side of the table, positioning himself where he could maintain eye contact with everyone present while keeping his documents organized and accessible. "Thank you all for being here today," he began, his voice carrying the formal tone that legal proceedings seemed to require. "Before we begin the formal reading of Elena Rodriguez's last will and testament, I want to express my sincere condolences to the family. Elena was not only a remarkable businesswoman but also a person of extraordinary character and wisdom. I had the privilege of serving as her attorney for more than 30 years, and I can honestly say that she was one of the most thoughtful and principled clients I ever had the honor to represent." Uncle Robert nodded gravely, accepting the condolences with the dignity befitting the head of a grieving family. "Thank you, James. Mother lived a full and meaningful life, and we're grateful for the guidance you provided her over the years. She always spoke highly of your counsel and your discretion in handling her affairs." Mr. Peterson smiled slightly at the compliment, but his expression remained serious as he opened his briefcase and began arranging documents on the table. "Elena's will is comprehensive and detailed, reflecting the complexity of her business holdings and her deep consideration of how her legacy should be distributed. I want to prepare you all for the fact that some of the provisions may come as a surprise, as Elena was very strategic in her decision-making and had specific reasons for each bequest that may not have been apparent to family members during her lifetime." Brandon leaned forward slightly, his business instincts clearly engaged by the mention of complexity and strategy. "We understand that Mother built a substantial business over the years. We're prepared to handle whatever administrative requirements might be involved in the transition process." "I'm glad to hear that," Mr. Peterson replied, though something in his tone suggested that Brandon's confidence might be premature. Let me begin with some background information that will help you understand the full scope of Elena's estate. As you know, she founded Rodriguez Construction in 1962 with a small loan and an enormous amount of determination. What you may not fully realize is the extent to which that company grew and diversified over the subsequent 60 years. He opened the first folder and spread several documents across the table, their official letterheads and legal formatting immediately commanding attention. Rodriguez Construction and Development is now the parent company for 17 subsidiary organizations involved in commercial construction, residential development, property management, and investment services. The company owns commercial properties in 12 states, with a combined value of approximately $800 million. Additionally, Elena maintained a personal investment portfolio worth approximately $2.4 billion, consisting of stocks, bonds, real estate holdings and equity positions in various private companies. The silence that followed his words was profound and absolute. Uncle Robert's confident expression flickered, replaced by something that looked almost like confusion. Patricia's perfectly manicured hand moved instinctively to her pearl necklace, a gesture that seemed unconscious and defensive. Brandon's laptop remained forgotten as he stared at the documents spread across the table, his mind clearly struggling to process numbers that were far larger than anything he had anticipated. Ashley was the first to find her voice, though it came out higher and more strained than usual. "I'm sorry, did you say $2.4 billion? That can't be right." Abuela lived in a duplex in Maryvale. She drove a Honda that was older than my college degree. She clipped coupons from the Sunday paper. "Yes, she did all of those things," Mr. Peterson confirmed with a gentle smile. Elena was very deliberate about maintaining a modest lifestyle despite her substantial wealth. She believed strongly that money without wisdom was dangerous, and she wanted to ensure that her resources were ultimately inherited by someone who understood the difference between having wealth and being defined by it. Tyler had been frantically taking notes on his laptop, but now he stopped typing and looked up with an expression of stunned disbelief. "Are you telling us that our grandmother was secretly worth over $3 billion while she was living like she was on a fixed income? Why would she do that? What was the point of having that much money if you weren't going to use it to improve your quality of life?" Mr. Peterson's smile became more pronounced, as if Tyler's question had revealed something important about his character. "Elena used her wealth constantly, Tyler. She funded scholarships for underprivileged students, supported homeless shelters and food banks throughout the Phoenix area, and quietly covered medical expenses for families who couldn't afford health care. The difference was that she focused on using her money to help others rather than to acquire luxury goods for herself. She believed that true wealth came from what you could give rather than what you could accumulate." Uncle Robert had recovered enough from his initial shock to resume his authoritative demeanor, though there was now an underlying tension in his voice that hadn't been there before. "This is certainly more substantial than we anticipated, but I think we're prepared to handle the transition. I've been managing the operational aspects of Rodriguez Construction for years, and I have a complete understanding of our assets and obligations. With proper legal and financial advice, we should be able to maintain the company's growth trajectory while honoring Mother's philanthropic commitments." "I appreciate your confidence, Robert," Mr. Peterson replied, "but I'm afraid there may be some misunderstandings about Elena's intentions regarding succession. She was very specific about her wishes for the distribution of her estate, and she spent considerable time deliberating over her decisions. Would you like me to proceed with the formal reading of the will?" The family members exchanged glances around the table, their expressions ranging from eager anticipation to barely concealed anxiety. Uncle Robert straightened his tie and nodded formally. "Yes, please proceed. We're ready to hear Mother's final wishes." Mr. Peterson opened the bound document that contained Abuela Elena's will, his reading glasses reflecting the afternoon light as he found the appropriate section. "I, Elena Maria Rodriguez, being of sound mind and body, do hereby set forth my last will and testament for the distribution of my worldly possessions and business interests upon my death. He paused briefly, allowing the formality of the moment to settle over the room like a heavy blanket. The only sounds were the soft whisper of air conditioning and the distant murmur of conversations from the reception area, where guests were still gathering to share memories and pay their respects. Here in the conference room, however, all attention was focused on the words that would reshape the Rodriguez family forever. To my son Robert Rodriguez, who has served the company faithfully for many years, and who has provided me with the joy of watching his children grow into capable adults, I leave the sum of $500,000, along with my gratitude for his dedication and my hopes for his continued happiness and prosperity. Uncle Robert's face went through a remarkable transformation as the implications of those words sank in. $500,000 was a substantial inheritance by most people's standards, but it was a tiny fraction of the estate Mr. Peterson had just described. His mouth opened slightly, then closed again as if he were trying to formulate a response to something he couldn't quite comprehend. To my grandson Brandon Rodriguez, whose intelligence and business acumen have impressed me throughout his career, I leave the sum of $250,000, along with my encouragement for him to use his talents to build something meaningful and lasting in whatever field he chooses to pursue. Brandon's confident posture crumbled like a building with its foundation removed. The inheritance was generous enough to pay off his student loans and provide a comfortable cushion for future investments, but it was nowhere near the transformational wealth he had been expecting. His carefully laid plans for expanding Rodriguez construction into new markets suddenly seemed irrelevant and presumptuous. To my granddaughter Ashley Rodriguez, whose creativity and social skills have brought joy to many family gatherings, I leave the sum of $250,000, along with my hope that she will use her gifts to make a positive difference in whatever communities she chooses to call home. Ashley's perfect composure finally cracked, her eyes filling with tears that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with shock and disappointment. She had spent years cultivating relationships within Phoenix society, positioning herself as a future philanthropist and community leader, only to discover that her financial foundation for those ambitions had just evaporated. To my grandson Tyler Chen, whose analytical mind and educational achievements have made me proud, I leave the sum of $250,000, along with my confidence that he will apply his knowledge and skills in ways that honor both his heritage and his potential. Tyler's laptop screen had gone dark while he sat motionless, his note-taking forgotten in the face of revelations that no amount of business school training had prepared him to handle. His plans for advising the family on estate management and tax strategies suddenly seemed laughably naive, based as they were on assumptions that had just been proven completely incorrect. The silence in the room was deafening as Mr. Peterson paused to turn the page, his expression carefully neutral despite the emotional devastation he was witnessing around the table. Uncle Robert's hands were clenched into fists, his knuckles white with tension. Patricia's breathing had become shallow and rapid, her chest rising and falling with the rhythm of barely controlled panic. The golden children of the Rodriguez family were discovering that their assumptions about their inheritance had been as fragile as soap bubbles. The remainder of my estate, Mr. Peterson continued, his voice steady and clear, including all business holdings, real estate properties, investment portfolios, and liquid assets, totaling approximately $3.2 billion, I leave to my granddaughter Maya Rodriguez, who has demonstrated throughout her life the wisdom, compassion, and integrity that I believe are essential for stewarding great wealth responsibly. The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion, visible and tangible but somehow impossible to fully comprehend. I felt the eyes of every person in the room turn toward me, their gazes heavy with shock, disbelief, and something that might have been accusation. My own breathing had stopped completely, as if my body had forgotten how to perform its most basic functions in the face of such overwhelming news. Uncle Robert was the first to recover enough to speak, though his voice came out as little more than a hoarse whisper. There must be some mistake. Maya works as an elementary school teacher, she drives a 15-year-old car, she lives in a one-bedroom apartment and shops at thrift stores. How could Mother possibly think she's qualified to manage a business empire worth billions of dollars? Mr. Peterson's expression softened with something that looked like sympathy, though whether it was directed toward Uncle Robert or toward me was unclear. Elena's decision was based on years of careful observation and consideration. She believed that Maya's character, values, and relationship with her demonstrated the qualities necessary for responsible stewardship of great wealth. She was particularly impressed by Maya's consistent kindness, her dedication to education and community service, and her apparent contentment with a modest lifestyle despite having access to more resources. Brandon found his voice next, though it carried a note of desperation that was almost painful to hear. But Maya doesn't know anything about running a business. She's never managed employees or dealt with investors or handled complex financial instruments. She wouldn't even know where to begin with something this sophisticated. Elena was aware of Maya's lack of business experience, Mr. Peterson acknowledged. That's why the will includes provisions for a comprehensive support structure, including a board of experienced advisors, professional management teams for each subsidiary company, and a gradual transition process that will allow Maya to learn and grow into her responsibilities over time. Elena believed that character and wisdom were more important than experience, because experience can be gained while character is much more difficult to develop. Ashley's tears had evolved into something approaching hysteria, her carefully composed facade cracking completely under the weight of disappointment and disbelief. This isn't fair. We've been the successful ones our whole lives. We went to the best schools, built impressive careers, maintained our relationships with the family. Maya just existed. She never showed any ambition or drive or interest in the family business. Why would Abuela reward mediocrity while punishing achievement? The accusation in her voice was like a physical blow, but before I could formulate any kind of response, Mr. Peterson intervened with the quiet authority that came from decades of handling family disputes over inheritance matters. Ashley, I understand that this news is shocking and disappointing, but I think it's important to understand Elena's perspective on what constitutes achievement and success. She watched all of her grandchildren carefully over the years, and she saw different types of accomplishments and different approaches to life. What she valued most highly was not professional success or social status, but rather kindness, humility, genuine care for others, and the ability to remain grounded despite access to privilege. Tyler had finally managed to close his laptop, though his hands were shaking slightly as he performed the simple task. So you're saying that our grandmother punished us for being successful, that she held our achievements against us? Not at all, Mr. Peterson replied patiently. Elena was proud of all of your accomplishments and grateful for the ways you've contributed to the family's reputation and success. But she also observed how you interacted with her personally, how you treated people who couldn't offer you anything in return, and how you handled the responsibilities and privileges you already possessed. She was looking for someone who would use great wealth as a tool for good, rather than as a source of personal gratification or social status. The room fell silent again as the full implications of his words settled over the family like a heavy fog. Everything they had believed about themselves, about their relationship with Abuela Elena, about their place in the family hierarchy, had been turned upside down in the space of a few minutes. The golden children had been revealed as tin, while the overlooked granddaughter had been transformed into the heiress to an empire. Uncle Robert's voice, when he finally spoke again, was barely audible. What happens now? How is this transition supposed to work? Maya can't just walk into the Rodriguez construction offices tomorrow and start making executive decisions. Mr. Peterson nodded thoughtfully. Elena anticipated that concern, which is why she established a comprehensive transition plan. Maya will have access to the best legal, financial, and business advisory services available, along with a board of directors that includes some of the most experienced professionals in the industry. The existing management teams will continue operating the various subsidiary companies, while Maya learns about the business and gradually assumes more direct oversight responsibilities. He opened another folder and removed a thick document that appeared to contain dozens of pages of detailed instructions and contingency plans. Elena spent the last 5 years of her life developing this transition strategy, working with teams of experts to ensure that the transfer of ownership would be as smooth as possible while providing Maya with every resource she might need to succeed in her new role. I finally found my voice, though it came out smaller and more uncertain than I had intended. What if I'm not capable of handling this responsibility? What if Abuela was wrong about my ability to manage something this complex and important? Mr. Peterson smiled at me with genuine warmth for the first time since the reading had begun. Elena anticipated that question as well, Maya. She said to tell you that she had watched you handle every challenge life had given you with grace and determination, from losing your father at a young age to putting yourself through college while caring for your mother. She believed that someone who could overcome those obstacles while maintaining their compassion and integrity would be more than capable of learning to manage business challenges as well. The weight of his words settled over me like a blanket, simultaneously comforting and overwhelming. I thought about all those afternoons in Abuela Elena's kitchen, all the conversations we had shared while cooking together or working in her garden. Had she been evaluating me all along, testing my character while I thought we were simply spending time together? Or had she simply been getting to know me well enough to trust me with the legacy she had spent her lifetime building? Around the table, my family members were beginning to process their new reality with varying degrees of acceptance and resistance. Uncle Robert sat staring at his hands, probably calculating how this development would affect his position at Rodriguez Construction and his plans for the future. Patricia was dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, though whether she was crying from grief or disappointment was impossible to determine. Brandon and Ashley looked like they were still waiting for someone to tell them that this was all an elaborate mistake or a cruel joke. Only Tyler seemed to be adapting to the new circumstances with anything approaching equanimity. His business school training had apparently included courses on managing unexpected developments because he was already formulating questions about the practical implications of the inheritance. Maya, he said, his voice carefully controlled and professional, I hope you know that despite our shock about this situation, we're here to support you in whatever way we can. This is a massive responsibility, and you're going to need all the help you can get from people who understand the family and the business. His offer sounded genuine, though I couldn't help but wonder whether it was motivated by altruism or by the hope that supporting me might somehow benefit his own position in the new family hierarchy. Either way, I appreciated the gesture and the acknowledgement that we were all going to need time to adjust to our new reality. Thank you, Tyler, I replied. I'm sure I'm going to need advice and support from everyone. This isn't something I ever expected or prepared for, and I want to make sure I honor Abuela's trust while also maintaining the relationships that are important to all of us. Mr. Peterson began gathering his documents, signaling that the formal reading was drawing to a close. There are many more details to discuss in the coming weeks, but I think this is enough information for today. Maya, I'll need to schedule several meetings with you to go over the specifics of your inheritance and begin the transition process. For the rest of the family, I want to emphasize that Elena's decision was not a rejection of your worth or your contributions to the family, but rather a reflection of her particular vision for how her wealth should be used in the future. As we prepared to leave the conference room and return to our respective lives, I couldn't help but reflect on how completely everything had changed in the space of an hour. This morning I had been Maya Rodriguez, the third-grade teacher who lived paycheck to paycheck and worried about car repairs and student loan payments. Tonight I would go to sleep as Maya Rodriguez, the billionaire heiress responsible for managing an empire and carrying forward the legacy of one of the most remarkable women I had ever known. The transformation was so complete and so sudden that it felt almost surreal, like something that had happened to someone else in a movie or a book. But the shocked expressions on my family members' faces were real enough, and the stack of legal documents Mr. Peterson had left me was solid and undeniable proof that this new reality was mine to navigate. As we filed out of the conference room and back into the reception area, where the last few guests were still lingering over coffee and dessert, I caught sight of my reflection in the mirror-polished surface of the conference table. The woman looking back at me still had the same face, the same discount dress, the same uncertainty about what came next. But behind her eyes was the beginning of something new, not just wealth or power, but the enormous responsibility that came with both. The ride home from the Scottsdale Country Club felt like traveling through a dream where familiar landmarks had been rearranged by an invisible hand. The same streets I had driven countless times before seemed different now, as if the knowledge of my inheritance had altered the fundamental properties of reality itself. My Honda Corolla, with its faded paint and rattling air conditioner, suddenly felt like a costume I was wearing rather than a reflection of who I actually was. The fast food restaurants and strip malls that lined Camelback Road looked exactly the same, but I found myself wondering about the people inside them, about their struggles and dreams, and whether any of them had ever experienced such a complete transformation of their circumstances in the span of a single afternoon. My small apartment in Central Phoenix had never felt more modest than it did when I turned the key in the lock that evening. The living room, with its second-hand furniture and walls decorated with student artwork from my classroom, seemed to belong to someone else entirely. I sat on my thrift store couch and stared at the stack of legal documents Mr. Peterson had given me, their official letterheads and dense legal language serving as tangible proof that everything had actually happened. The numbers printed on those pages were so large that they seemed abstract, like theoretical concepts rather than resources I could actually access and deploy. $3.2 billion. I said the words aloud to my empty apartment, listening to how they sounded in my own voice. They felt foreign and unwieldy, like trying to speak a language I had never learned. How does someone spend that much money? How do you even begin to comprehend resources on that scale? I had been living on a teacher's salary for 6 years, carefully budgeting every expense and celebrating small victories like finding a good deal on groceries or managing to save $50 in a month. The transition from that mindset to suddenly having access to more money than entire countries possessed felt like trying to jump across the Grand Canyon. The first phone call came at 7:30, just as I was heating up a frozen dinner that I had bought with a coupon the week before. Uncle Robert's name appeared on my phone screen, and I stared at it for several rings before finally answering. His voice, when it came through the speaker, sounded strained and carefully controlled, as if he were reading from a script he had rehearsed multiple times. Maya, I hope you understand that today's news came as quite a shock to all of us. I want you to know that despite our surprise, the family stands ready to support you in whatever way we can during this transition. This is an enormous responsibility, and you're going to need experienced guidance to navigate the complexities of managing such substantial business interests. I could hear the effort it was costing him to maintain his diplomatic tone, the way he was forcing himself to be gracious in the face of disappointment that must have felt like a physical blow. Here was a man who had spent decades positioning himself as the natural heir to his mother's empire, only to discover that she had been secretly evaluating his worthiness and had found him wanting. The humiliation of that realization, combined with the practical concerns about his own future, must have been overwhelming. I appreciate that, Uncle Robert, I replied, trying to match his careful tone. I know this is a difficult situation for everyone, and I'm grateful for any guidance you can offer. I certainly don't want to disrupt the relationships and working arrangements that have been successful for the company. There was a long pause before he responded, and I could almost hear him recalibrating his approach based on my words. Well, I'm glad to hear you say that. The company has been running smoothly under the current management structure, and it would be unfortunate if sudden changes were to jeopardize the relationships we've built with clients and partners over the years. Perhaps we could arrange a meeting early next week to discuss how the transition might proceed with minimal disruption to ongoing operations. The subtext of his suggestion was clear enough. He was hoping to maintain his position and authority within the company structure, to continue operating as he always had, while I remained a figurehead owner who left the actual decision-making to more experienced hands. It was a reasonable proposal from his perspective, and it might even have been the wisest approach given my complete lack of business experience. But something about the way he phrased it, the assumption that I would naturally defer to his expertise and authority, reminded me of all the family conversations where my opinions and perspectives had been politely dismissed or ignored entirely. "That sounds like a good idea," I said carefully. "I'll definitely want to meet with you and learn about how the company operates. I think it's important for me to understand every aspect of the business before making any decisions about the future." Another pause, this one shorter but somehow more tense. "Of course, though I hope you'll keep in mind that some aspects of the business are quite complex and technical. It takes years to develop the kind of expertise necessary to make informed decisions about major construction projects and development deals." Mother was brilliant in her day, but even she relied heavily on experienced advisors and managers to handle the details of day-to-day operations. The condescension in his voice was subtle but unmistakable, the same tone I had been hearing from family members my entire life whenever they wanted to explain why my input wasn't really necessary for important decisions. It was the voice of someone who had never questioned his own superiority and couldn't quite accept that circumstances had suddenly placed him in a position where he needed to ask for my approval, rather than simply informing me of decisions that had already been made. "I'm sure there's a lot for me to learn," I agreed, "but I think Abuela must have had her reasons for structuring things the way she did. I want to make sure I understand her vision for the company before deciding how to move forward." The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Uncle Robert carefully probing to determine how much authority I intended to exercise and how willing I might be to maintain the status quo. I found myself being deliberately vague in my responses, partly because I genuinely didn't know what I wanted to do, and partly because some instinct warned me against committing to anything before I had a chance to fully understand the situation I had inherited. By the time I ended the call, my frozen dinner had gone cold and my head was spinning with questions I didn't know how to answer. How do you evaluate the performance of business managers when you don't understand the business they're managing? How do you distinguish between genuine expertise and self-serving advice? How do you honor the trust someone has placed in you while also acknowledging your own limitations and inexperience? The next call came from Brandon 20 minutes later, his approach more direct and practical than his father's diplomatic maneuvering. "Maya, I know today was overwhelming for everyone, but I want you to know that I'm here to help in whatever way I can. I've been working in the construction industry for 5 years now, and I have connections with most of our major clients and subcontractors. If you're serious about taking an active role in running the company, you're going to need someone who can bridge the gap between your learning curve and the immediate demands of ongoing projects." His offer was more honest than his father's, acknowledging both my inexperience and his own desire to remain relevant in the new organizational structure. But there was also an underlying assumption that my learning curve would necessarily be lengthy, and that I would need extensive support from people who understood the business better than I did. It wasn't an unreasonable assumption, but something about the way he expressed it rankled me. "What kinds of immediate demands are we talking about?" I asked, genuinely curious about the scope of responsibilities I had inherited. "Well, we've got 3 major commercial developments in progress right now, plus 2 residential projects that are scheduled to break ground next month. There are zoning hearings, contractor negotiations, permit approvals, financing arrangements, and probably a dozen other moving parts that need constant attention. Any delays or mistakes could cost the company millions of dollars and damage relationships that took years to build. The information was clearly intended to emphasize the complexity and urgency of the business challenges I would be facing, but it also gave me my first real sense of the scope of what Abuela Elena had been managing all these years. While her family had seen her as a sweet old lady who lived modestly and cooked traditional meals, she had actually been overseeing a sophisticated operation involving millions of dollars and hundreds of employees. The contrast between her public persona and her private responsibilities was staggering. How did Abuela manage all of that? I asked. Did she attend zoning hearings and contractor meetings? Brandon's laugh was short and slightly bitter. No, of course not. She left all the operational details to Dad and the other managers. She focused on the big picture stuff, overall strategy, major investment decisions, that kind of thing. Which is probably what you should do too, at least until you've had time to get up to speed on how the industry works. There it was again, the assumption that I would naturally follow the same pattern Abuela Elena had established, delegating the real work to the men in the family while maintaining nominal ownership. But something about that explanation didn't ring true. If Abuela Elena had been as hands-off as Brandon suggested, how had she managed to build such a successful and sophisticated business empire? How had she made the strategic decisions that had transformed a small construction company into a multi-billion-dollar enterprise? The conversation with Brandon was followed by similar calls from Ashley and Tyler, each offering their own version of support and guidance, while also positioning themselves as indispensable resources for navigating my new responsibilities. Ashley emphasized her connections within Phoenix society and her understanding of the charitable organizations that Abuela Elena had supported over the years. Tyler focused on his business education and his expertise in financial planning and estate management. All of them spoke to me with the same tone of patient condescension, as if they were explaining complicated concepts to a child who was trying very hard to understand, but might not quite be capable of grasping the full implications. By 9 o'clock, I had turned off my phone and poured myself a glass of the cheap wine I kept in my refrigerator for special occasions. Sitting in my small kitchen, surrounded by the modest possessions that had defined my life for the past 6 years, I tried to process everything that had happened and everything that was about to change. The woman who had gone to work that morning teaching third graders about fractions and spelling was now responsible for managing a business empire that employed thousands of people and generated hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue every year. The weight of that responsibility was almost paralyzing, but there was also something liberating about it. For the first time in my life, I had the resources to make a real difference in the world. I could fund scholarships for students who couldn't afford college, support teachers who were struggling with inadequate classroom supplies, invest in community programs that would help families like the ones I had grown up with. The money wasn't just a personal windfall, it was a tool for creating opportunities and solving problems on a scale I had never imagined possible. But first, I needed to understand exactly what I had inherited and how it all worked. The next morning, I called Mr. Peterson and asked him to arrange meetings with the key managers and advisors who had been working with Abuela Elena. I wanted to hear their perspectives on the business, their assessments of current challenges and opportunities, and their recommendations for how I should approach my new role. I also wanted to visit the actual construction sites and development projects, to see with my own eyes what the company was building and how the work was being accomplished. Over the following weeks, I began to understand the true scope of Abuela Elena's accomplishments and the sophisticated network of professionals she had assembled to help her manage her various business interests. The picture that emerged was very different from the one my family had painted. Rather than being a passive figurehead who delegated all important decisions to others, she had been an active and engaged leader who understood every aspect of her business and made all the major strategic choices herself. Her managers and advisors spoke of her with a combination of respect and affection that suggested genuine admiration for her intelligence and judgment. They described weekly meetings where she would review financial reports, discuss upcoming projects, and provide guidance on everything from personnel decisions to marketing strategies. She had been particularly interested in innovative construction techniques and sustainable building practices, often pushing her teams to explore new approaches that would reduce environmental impact while maintaining profitability. The more I learned about how she had actually operated, the more I understood why she had chosen to live so modestly despite her enormous wealth. She had genuinely believed that ostentatious displays of luxury were wasteful and counterproductive, that money should be used to create value rather than to signal status. Her simple lifestyle hadn't been a test for her family as much as it had been a reflection of her authentic values and priorities. I also began to understand why she had chosen me as her heir rather than the family members who seemed more obviously qualified for the role. Uncle Robert, for all his experience and competence, had always viewed the business primarily as a source of personal wealth and social status. His focus was on maximizing profits and expanding operations, which were certainly important objectives, but he had little interest in the philanthropic activities that had been central to Abuela Elena's vision for how wealth should be used. Brandon and Ashley had inherited their father's perspective, seeing business success as a means to achieving the kind of lifestyle they felt they deserved, rather than as a platform for creating broader social benefits. They were intelligent and capable, but their motivations were fundamentally self-serving in ways that didn't align with Abuela Elena's values. Tyler, despite his business education and analytical skills, had always struck her as someone who was more interested in theoretical concepts than in practical applications. He could create impressive spreadsheets and deliver sophisticated presentations, but he lacked the intuitive understanding of people and relationships that successful business leadership required. By contrast, my years as a teacher had given me experience in managing complex situations with limited resources, building relationships with diverse groups of people, and finding creative solutions to practical problems. My volunteer work with literacy programs had demonstrated my commitment to using whatever advantages I possessed to help others improve their circumstances. Most importantly, my contentment with a modest lifestyle had shown her that I could be trusted with great wealth because I didn't need it to feel valuable or successful as a person. The transition process was gradual and carefully managed, with experienced advisors helping me understand the intricacies of each business operation while gradually increasing my involvement in decision-making processes. I discovered that I had better instincts for business than I had expected, particularly when it came to understanding what motivated employees and customers and how to build relationships that would support long-term success. My family members adapted to the new reality with varying degrees of grace and acceptance. Uncle Robert eventually settled into a consultative role that allowed him to maintain his dignity while acknowledging my ultimate authority over major decisions. Brandon and Ashley found ways to contribute their skills and expertise, while also pursuing their own career interests outside the family business. Tyler proved to be genuinely helpful as a financial advisor, his analytical abilities complementing my more intuitive approach to problem solving. The most challenging aspect of my new life wasn't managing the business or learning to handle enormous financial resources, but rather navigating the changed dynamics within my family and social circle. People who had known me as the struggling teacher suddenly began treating me with a deference that felt artificial and uncomfortable. Old friends seemed uncertain about how to relate to someone whose circumstances had changed so dramatically, while new acquaintances were clearly interested in my wealth rather than my personality or character. I learned to be selective about sharing details of my inheritance, choosing to maintain my modest lifestyle and continue teaching while gradually taking on more responsibilities with the family business. The combination allowed me to stay grounded in the work I loved while also honoring Abuela Elena's trust in my ability to steward her legacy responsibly. 6 months after that shocking day at the Scottsdale Country Club, I was sitting in Abuela Elena's former office at the Rodriguez construction headquarters, reviewing plans for a new affordable housing development that would provide quality homes for working families in West Phoenix. The project represented everything she had valued most, using business success to create opportunities for people who needed them, building something lasting and meaningful, rather than simply generating profit for its own sake. The office had barely changed since her death. Her desk still held the same family photographs and the small succulent garden she had tended with such care. The walls were lined with awards from community organizations and thank you letters from scholarship recipients, tangible reminders of how she had used her resources to make a difference in individual lives. Sitting in her chair, surrounded by the evidence of her remarkable life and achievements, I finally understood why she had chosen me as her successor. It wasn't because I was the most qualified candidate from a technical standpoint, or because I had demonstrated superior business acumen, or because I had earned the inheritance through my own professional accomplishments. She had chosen me because she believed I would use her wealth the way she had used it, not as an end in itself, but as a means to create opportunities and solve problems for people who might not otherwise have access to them. The responsibility was enormous and sometimes overwhelming, but it was also deeply fulfilling in ways I had never anticipated. Every day brought new challenges and new opportunities to make decisions that would affect thousands of people's lives. The work was complex and demanding, but it was also meaningful in ways that teaching, despite all its rewards, had never quite achieved. Looking back on that transformative day, I realized that the most important lesson Abuela Elena had taught me wasn't about business or wealth management or family dynamics. It was about the difference between having resources and being worthy of them, between achieving success and using it responsibly. She had spent her life demonstrating that true wealth came not from what you could accumulate, but from what you could give, and that the most important legacy anyone could leave was the positive impact they had made on other people's lives. The mocking voices of my cousins, the assumptions about my limitations, the years of being overlooked and underestimated, all of it had been preparation for this moment when I would need the humility and perspective that came from understanding what it felt like to be dismissed and marginalized. Those experiences had taught me empathy and resilience, qualities that no amount of privilege or education could provide. As I signed the final documents approving the affordable housing project, I thought about all the families who would benefit from Abuela Elena's vision and my commitment to carrying it forward. The houses we were building would provide stability and opportunity for people who had been struggling to find decent, affordable places to live. The jobs created by the construction process would support workers and their families throughout the Phoenix area. The community centers and parks included in the development would become gathering places where neighbors could build relationships and support each other through life's challenges. This was what wealth was truly for, not to elevate the wealthy above others, but to lift others up to a level where they could pursue their own dreams and aspirations. Abuela Elena had understood that principle from the beginning of her business career, and she had spent 60 years demonstrating how it could be applied in practice. Now it was my turn to carry that vision forward, to prove worthy of the trust she had placed in me, and to ensure that her legacy would continue benefiting others for generations to come. The simple life I had lived before my inheritance hadn't been a limitation or a failure, it had been perfect preparation for the complex life I was living now. Every lesson I had learned about finding contentment with less, about treating people with dignity regardless of their circumstances, about using limited resources creatively and efficiently, had proven invaluable as I learned to manage unlimited resources responsibly. Sometimes the person who seems least likely to succeed is actually the person who has been developing exactly the skills and perspective that success requires. Sometimes being overlooked is the greatest gift you can receive, because it teaches you to find your worth from within, rather than from others' recognition. And sometimes the most important inheritance you can receive isn't money, or property, or social position, but the wisdom to use whatever you've been given in service of something larger than yourself. The first anniversary of Abuela Elena's passing arrived on a Tuesday morning in late September, when the Phoenix heat had finally begun its slow retreat, and the desert air carried hints of the cooler months ahead. I stood in front of the mirror in my new home, a modest three-bedroom house in Arcadia that I had purchased, not because I needed the space, but because it had a large backyard where I could recreate the garden Abuela Elena had taught me to tend. The woman looking back at me wore a tailored navy suit that actually fit properly, though I had resisted the urge to shop at the designer boutiques Ashley had recommended and instead found an excellent tailor who could alter off the rack pieces to look custom made. The past year had transformed me in ways that went far beyond clothing choices or living arrangements. I had learned to navigate board meetings with the same confidence I brought to parent-teacher conferences, discovered that reading financial statements required many of the same analytical skills as assessing student progress reports, and found that the patience necessary for teaching 8-year-olds translated surprisingly well to managing executives who were accustomed to getting their own way. The learning curve had been steep and occasionally terrifying, but every challenge I had faced had ultimately reinforced Abuela Elena's belief that character mattered more than credentials. Today marked a significant milestone in my journey as the head of Rodriguez Construction and Development. We were hosting a dedication ceremony for the affordable housing project I had approved 6 months earlier, the development that would provide quality homes for 150 families in West Phoenix. The project had been completed ahead of schedule and under budget, a fact that had impressed even Uncle Robert and convinced several skeptical board members that perhaps I knew what I was doing after all. More importantly, it represented exactly the kind of work Abuela Elena had envisioned when she structured her will to prioritize community benefit over personal profit. The dedication ceremony was scheduled for 10 o'clock at the development site, followed by a private family gathering at the community center Abuela Elena had funded years ago. I had deliberately kept both events low-key and informal, resisting suggestions from the marketing team that we should invite politicians and media coverage to maximize publicity for the company. This wasn't about generating positive press or enhancing the Rodriguez brand, it was about honoring my grandmother's memory and celebrating something good we had managed to accomplish in her name. My phone buzzed with a text from Jenny Kim, my former roommate who had become my closest confidant during the turbulent months following the inheritance. She had watched me navigate the impossible transition from paycheck-to-paycheck teacher to billionaire CEO with a mixture of amusement and admiration, providing a grounding perspective whenever I started to lose sight of who I had been before everything changed. Her message was characteristically direct and encouraging. Remember, you're still the same person who used to eat ramen 3 nights a week and celebrate when gas prices dropped 5 cents. Don't let the fancy people make you forget that. Abuela chose you because of who you were, not who they think you should become. I smiled at the reminder and sent back a quick response before grabbing my keys and heading out to my car. I had finally replaced the ancient Corolla, but not with the luxury vehicle Uncle Robert had suggested would be more appropriate for someone in my position. Instead, I had purchased a reliable hybrid sedan that got excellent gas mileage and had enough cargo space to transport classroom supplies when I still occasionally volunteered at Desert Bloom Elementary. The choice had been deliberate and symbolic, a way of signaling to myself and others that I intended to maintain my values even as my circumstances continued to evolve. The drive to the development site took me through neighborhoods I had known my entire life, streets where families like mine had struggled to find affordable housing and decent opportunities. The contrast between these areas and the wealthy enclaves of Scottsdale and Paradise Valley had always struck me as fundamentally unjust, a visible reminder that zip codes often determine destinies more than talent or effort ever could. The project we were dedicating today wouldn't solve that systemic inequality, but it would provide 150 families with safe, comfortable homes and a chance to build stability in their lives. When I arrived at the site, I was pleased to see that the event planning team had followed my instructions to keep things simple and welcoming. Folding chairs were arranged in neat rows facing a small stage, with colorful banners celebrating the completion of the project, but no corporate logos or promotional materials in sight. Families who would be moving into the new homes wandered through the model units, their faces reflecting a mixture of excitement and disbelief that these beautiful houses were actually going to be theirs. Children ran across the playground equipment that had been installed in the central courtyard, their laughter carrying across the space like music. Brandon was already there when I arrived, supervising the final setup details with the efficiency that had made him valuable to the company despite the awkwardness of our new working relationship. He had adjusted to the changed family dynamics better than I had expected, channeling his disappointment about the inheritance into determination to prove his worth through his contributions to company projects. We had developed a professional rapport based on mutual respect, rather than the familial obligation that had defined our earlier interactions, and I had come to appreciate his genuine expertise even as I learned to question his assumptions and push back on recommendations that didn't align with my priorities. "Everything looks good," he said as I approached, his tone businesslike but warm. "The families started arriving about 20 minutes ago, and they're incredibly excited about the units. Several of them have already asked if there are job opportunities with Rodriguez Construction because they want to work for a company that cares about communities like theirs." The comment reminded me of one of the most satisfying aspects of running the company according to Abuela Elena's principles. By prioritizing community benefit and fair treatment of workers, we had actually enhanced the company's reputation and attracted talented employees who might otherwise have chosen to work elsewhere. It turned out that doing good and doing well weren't mutually exclusive objectives, though it required patience and long-term thinking rather than the quarterly profit maximization that many corporations pursued. "That's wonderful," I replied. "Make sure someone from HR is available to talk with them about opportunities." Abuela always believed in hiring from the communities we served. Ashley arrived next, accompanied by her husband Marcus and their 6-month-old daughter Elena, named after the grandmother who had shaped all of our lives in ways we were still discovering. My cousin had mellowed considerably since the will reading, her initial resentment gradually transforming into something resembling acceptance and perhaps even respect. Motherhood had given her a new perspective on what mattered in life, and she had recently approached me about establishing a scholarship fund for single mothers pursuing higher education, inspired by her own mother's struggles after losing her first husband. "Maya, this is absolutely beautiful," she said, gesturing at the development with genuine enthusiasm. I know I didn't understand what Abuela was trying to accomplish when she structured her will the way she did, but seeing projects like this makes it so clear. She wasn't just passing on wealth, she was passing on responsibility and vision. Her acknowledgement meant more to me than she probably realized. The past year had been difficult for Ashley as she grappled with the loss of expectations that had defined her entire identity, but she had ultimately chosen growth over bitterness and found new purpose in using her social connections to support charitable causes rather than simply to advance her own status. We would never be close in the way that some families were, but we had developed an honest relationship based on who we actually were rather than the roles we had been assigned in childhood. Tyler arrived with his laptop bag and his characteristic efficiency, immediately beginning to document the event with photographs and notes that would be compiled into a report for the board of directors. His analytical skills had proven invaluable over the past year as I worked to understand the financial implications of various business decisions, and he had become one of my most trusted advisors precisely because he was willing to provide honest assessments even when they contradicted my initial instincts. Uncle Robert and Patricia were the last family members to arrive, their presence carrying a weight of complicated emotions that had never been fully resolved. Uncle Robert had struggled more than anyone else with the changed family dynamics, his identity as the heir apparent to Rodriguez Construction having been so thoroughly undermined by his mother's will. He had initially considered leaving the company entirely, but a long conversation with Mr. Peterson had convinced him that he could still make valuable contributions even if he was no longer in control of strategic direction. "Maya," he said formally, extending his hand in greeting, "congratulations on completing this project successfully. The quality of construction is excellent, and the families seem genuinely appreciative of the opportunity you've provided them." The words were stiff and carefully chosen, reflecting the ongoing tension between his wounded pride and his grudging acknowledgement that I had managed to accomplish something worthwhile. We would probably never have the warm relationship I had enjoyed with Abuela Elena, but we had at least achieved a professional detente that allowed us to work together effectively, even if we would never be close. As the ceremony began, I took my place at the podium and looked out at the assembled crowd of families, company employees, community leaders, and relatives who had gathered to mark this milestone. The diversity of faces looking back at me represented everything Abuela Elena had valued most about this work: the opportunity to bring people together across lines of class and background, to create something that served genuine human needs rather than simply generating profit for investors. 1 year ago today, we lost an extraordinary woman who spent her life demonstrating that wealth is measured not by what you accumulate but by what you give. I began, my voice steady despite the emotion tightening my chest. "Elena Rodriguez built a business empire from nothing, but she never forgot where she came from, or why she was doing the work. Every decision she made was guided by a simple question: how can this create opportunity for people who need it most?" I paused to let those words settle over the audience, watching as several people nodded in recognition of the principle I was describing. These were people who understood what it meant to struggle, who knew firsthand how transformative a safe home and a stable community could be for a family trying to build a better future. This development represents her vision made concrete. These 150 homes aren't just buildings, they're foundations for dreams and launching pads for aspirations. They're places where children will do homework at kitchen tables, and parents will celebrate promotions, and families will build the kind of memories that last for generations. They're proof that business success and community benefit don't have to be competing objectives, that we can do well by doing good. As I continued speaking about the project and its significance, I noticed my family members listening with varying degrees of attention and emotional engagement. Brandon was taking notes on his phone, probably already thinking about how to apply lessons from this project to future developments. Ashley was bouncing baby Elena gently while listening, her expression thoughtful and engaged. Tyler was capturing photographs, while simultaneously live tweeting key quotes from my speech. Uncle Robert and Patricia sat stiffly in their folding chairs, their faces carefully neutral but their body language suggesting discomfort with the whole proceeding. The ceremony concluded with the presentation of keys to the first families who would be moving into their new homes. Watching their faces as they accepted those keys and stepped into spaces that were finally truly theirs reminded me of why this work mattered so much. These weren't statistics on a balance sheet or units in a development portfolio. They were real people whose lives were being meaningfully improved by decisions I had made and resources I had deployed. The responsibility was enormous, but so was the privilege of being able to make such a direct positive impact on people's circumstances. After the formal proceedings ended, I spent several hours touring the development with families and answering their questions about the community amenities and services that would be available to residents. Many of them shared stories about their previous housing situations: overcrowded apartments, unsafe neighborhoods, landlords who ignored maintenance requests, that reinforced my conviction that affordable housing was one of the most important investments we could make in strengthening communities. By the time the event wound down, and the last families had departed to explore their new homes, I was emotionally exhausted but deeply satisfied with what we had accomplished. The family gathering that followed was smaller and more intimate, held in the community center conference room that Abuela Elena had used for her weekly meetings with local nonprofit leaders. I had arranged for catering from the Mexican restaurant she had frequented for decades, the same modest establishment where she had celebrated special occasions and conducted informal business negotiations over plates of enchiladas and beans. The food was authentic and delicious, a reminder that quality and expense weren't synonymous, and that some of the best things in life came from humble sources. As we settled around the table with our plates of food, the conversation gradually shifted from polite small talk to more substantive discussion of family dynamics and relationships. Ashley was the one who finally addressed the elephant in the room, her characteristic directness cutting through the social niceties we had been maintaining. "Maya, I want to apologize for how I treated you before Abuela's will was read. I spent years assuming you were less successful than the rest of us because you had made poor choices or lacked ambition. I never considered that you might have been living according to different values, or that your modest lifestyle reflected contentment rather than limitation. I was wrong, and I'm sorry." Her apology was unexpected and genuinely moving, representing the kind of emotional honesty that had been rare in our family interactions. I could see Uncle Robert shifting uncomfortably in his chair, probably recognizing that similar apologies were overdue from him as well, but uncertain about how to express sentiments that didn't come naturally to his generation or temperament. "I appreciate that, Ashley," I replied carefully. "But I think we all made assumptions about each other based on surface appearances, rather than deeper understanding. The truth is that none of us really knew Abuela Elena as well as we thought we did. We saw what she wanted us to see, and we drew conclusions based on our own limited perspectives." Brandon nodded thoughtfully, setting down his fork to engage more fully with the conversation. "I've been thinking a lot about that over the past year. Abuela presented herself as this simple woman with modest means and traditional values, and we took that presentation at face value without questioning whether there might be more complexity beneath the surface. Meanwhile, she was running a sophisticated business empire and making strategic decisions that affected thousands of people's lives. The disconnect between her public persona and her private reality is pretty remarkable when you think about it. She was testing us," Tyler observed, his analytical mind characteristically focused on understanding the underlying logic of Abuela Elena's choices. "Not in a cruel way, but she wanted to see which of us would value her for who she was, rather than what she could provide. She created a situation where the grandchildren who visited her regularly and engaged with her authentically would be the ones who demonstrated the character traits she valued most." Uncle Robert finally found his voice, though it came out rougher and more strained than his usual polished tones. "I spent 30 years managing operations for Rodriguez Construction, and I genuinely believed that I was carrying forward my mother's vision for the company. It never occurred to me that she might have had a different vision entirely, one that prioritized community impact over profit maximization. I thought I was honoring her legacy by growing the business and increasing its value, but apparently, I was missing the point entirely." The admission was clearly painful for him, representing as it did an acknowledgement that his life's work had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what his mother valued most. But there was also something liberating in his willingness to finally voice what we had all been thinking, to put words to the disappointment and confusion that had characterized the past year of family interactions. "I don't think you were missing the point entirely," I said gently, surprising myself with my own willingness to offer him comfort and validation. "The company's financial success created the resources that made projects like today's affordable housing development possible. Abuela needed managers who could run efficient operations and generate sustainable profits, because without that foundation, the philanthropic work couldn't happen." Where we differed was in understanding that profit was a means to an end rather than an end in itself. The conversation continued for another hour, with family members sharing memories of Abuela Elena and gradually working toward a more honest understanding of our relationships with each other and with the legacy she had left us. It wasn't a complete reconciliation, the wounds were too deep, and the disappointments too significant for that, but it was a beginning, a tentative step toward building something more authentic than the superficial family harmony we had maintained in previous years. As the gathering wound down and family members prepared to return to their respective lives, Brandon pulled me aside for a private conversation. His expression was serious, but not hostile, suggesting that whatever he wanted to discuss was important to him. Maya, I want you to know that I've been working on a proposal for expanding our affordable housing initiatives into other Arizona cities. I know I was skeptical about prioritizing community benefit over profit margins when you first started implementing Abuela's vision, but this past year has shown me that there's actually a strong business case for doing good work. Our reputation has improved significantly, we're attracting talented employees who want to work for a company with values, and we're building relationships with community leaders that are opening doors to new opportunities. His words represented a significant evolution in his thinking, a shift from viewing corporate social responsibility as a constraint on profit to understanding it as a strategic advantage that could enhance long-term success. It was exactly the kind of transformation Abuela Elena had hoped to inspire by structuring her will the way she did, demonstrating that sometimes the most important inheritance you can pass on is a set of values and priorities rather than simply assets and resources. I'd love to see your proposal, I replied with genuine enthusiasm. One of the things I've learned this year is that I don't have all the answers, and I need smart people with different perspectives to help me figure out how to best use these resources. If you found ways to expand the affordable housing work while maintaining financial sustainability, that's exactly the kind of thinking we need. As I drove home that evening, exhausted but satisfied with how the day had unfolded, I found myself reflecting on the remarkable journey I had traveled over the past year. The scared, overwhelmed woman who had sat in that conference room at the Scottsdale Country Club listening to Mr. Peterson read Abuela Elena's will had evolved into someone more confident and capable, someone who was learning to trust her own judgment while remaining humble enough to seek guidance from people with more experience and expertise. The transformation hadn't been easy or linear. There had been moments of crushing self-doubt when I questioned whether Abuela Elena had made a terrible mistake in choosing me as her heir. There had been days when the responsibility felt overwhelming and the learning curve impossibly steep. There had been times when I longed for the simplicity of my former life, when my biggest concern was whether I could afford to replace my car's worn brake pads, and my most important decisions involved choosing curriculum materials for my third-grade classroom. But there had also been moments of profound satisfaction and purpose, times when I could see tangible evidence that the decisions I was making were improving people's lives in meaningful ways. The families moving into affordable homes, the scholarship recipients pursuing educational opportunities they couldn't have accessed otherwise, the community programs receiving funding that allowed them to expand their services, all of these represented real impact that wouldn't have been possible without the resources Abuela Elena had entrusted to my care. More importantly, I had discovered that the skills and experiences I had gained during my years as a teacher and volunteer were more relevant to running a business than I had ever imagined. The patience required to help struggling students master difficult concepts translated directly to helping overwhelmed employees develop new capabilities. The creativity necessary for teaching on a limited budget informed my approach to finding innovative solutions to complex business challenges. The empathy that made me an effective teacher made me a more thoughtful leader who considered the human impact of every decision. Perhaps most significantly, I had learned that being underestimated and overlooked for much of my life had actually been perfect preparation for the responsibility I now carried. Those experiences had taught me humility and perspective, had shown me what it felt like to be dismissed and marginalized, had given me insight into the struggles faced by people who existed outside circles of privilege and power. Without those lessons, I might have become exactly the kind of leader Abuela Elena feared, someone who wielded great resources without understanding the responsibility that came with them, someone who forgot that wealth was a tool for creating opportunity rather than a measure of personal worth. When I arrived home to my modest house in Arcadia, I walked through the backyard to the garden I had been cultivating according to Abuela Elena's techniques and traditions. The tomatoes were ripening on their vines, the pepper plants were producing abundantly, and the herbs filled the evening air with their distinctive scents. This small plot of land, tended with the same care and attention Abuela Elena had brought to her own garden, represented continuity and connection across generations. It reminded me that some of the most important legacies had nothing to do with money or property or corporate empires, but rather with the values and wisdom passed from one person to another through patient teaching and loving example. Standing there in the fading light, surrounded by growing things and carrying the weight of enormous responsibility, I finally understood what Abuela Elena had been trying to teach me all along. Wealth wasn't something you possessed, it was something you stewarded temporarily before passing it on to the next generation. Success wasn't measured by what you accumulated, but by what you enabled others to achieve. And the most important inheritance anyone could receive wasn't money or property, but rather the wisdom to use whatever resources you had in service of something larger than yourself. The modest life I had lived before my inheritance hadn't been a failure or a limitation, it had been perfect preparation for everything that followed, teaching me lessons that no amount of wealth or privilege could provide. And the extraordinary life I was living now wasn't really about the money at all, but about the opportunity to make a meaningful difference in the world, using resources that had been entrusted to my care by someone who believed I would use them wisely. Some people spend their entire lives being prepared for responsibilities they'll never receive. Others receive responsibilities they've never been prepared for. But occasionally, through some combination of circumstance and character, someone is given exactly the responsibility they've been unknowingly preparing for their entire life. That was the gift Abuela Elena had given me, not just her wealth, but her belief that I had been developing exactly the qualities necessary to steward it responsibly. The journey from overlooked teacher to billionaire philanthropist hadn't transformed who I fundamentally was. Instead, it had revealed capacities and capabilities that had always existed but had never been fully tested or expressed. The woman harvesting tomatoes in her backyard garden was the same person who now sat in boardrooms, making decisions that affected thousands of lives. The values that had guided me when I had nothing were the same values guiding me now that I had everything, and that ultimately was why Abuela Elena had chosen me. Not because I was the most qualified candidate or the most obviously successful grandchild, but because I was the one person who could be trusted with great wealth, precisely because I had never needed it to feel complete. The mocking voices and dismissive assumptions that had characterized my early life had prepared me for this moment by teaching me that worth came from within, rather than from others' recognition or approval. Sometimes the person everyone overlooks is exactly the person who has been developing the wisdom and character that transformational responsibility requires. Sometimes being underestimated is the greatest gift you can receive, because it teaches you to find your value in who you are, rather than in what others think of you. And sometimes the most important legacy you can leave isn't measured in dollars or property, but in the lives you've touched and the positive change you've enabled in the world. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.